Hello, friends, and welcome to a 2-hour compilation of the 16 most baffling missing persons cases I've covered so far. In these next 2 hours, we'll revisit the unexplained disappearances that have gripped our attention and left us searching for answers. These stories stand as reminders of the mysteries that surround us and the impact they have on those of us left behind. So join me on this journey as we look back on these perplexing cases and search for the truth. Number 1. Susan Osborne and Evan Chartrand. Susan Osborne and her son Evan moved from Michigan to Alabama while Susan was married to Evan's father. The couple later divorced, and Susan decided to remain in Alabama with Evan, despite all of her family living out of state. Susan was a private, independent person and devoted mother, whose favorite pastime was spending time with her children and fishing. Evan shared Susan's love of fishing and even made his own fishing lures. Witty, shy, and sweet are just a few of the words that are frequently used by friends and family to describe Evan. Evan's fourth-grade teacher said, quote, "The world was truly a better place with him in it," end quote. And he was truly a light in a dark world. Susan later began a relationship with another man and gave birth to her daughter. The relationship between Susan and her daughter's father ended around May of 2009. It was during this time that Holly Morris moved in across the street from Susan in Prattville, and the pair became instant friends. Quote, "She was one of the types of friends that if she ever said she was going to do something, well, she did it. She's very dependable and always there," end quote. Susan, unfortunately, didn't have the best track record with men, and after the relationship with her daughter's father ended, she decided to take a break from dating and focus on her kids. And for several years, Susan did just that. She spent time with Evan, her daughter, and their 2 dogs, Schnook and Sugar. However, in 2013, while she and Evan were spending the day doing what they loved, fishing, Susan met Jerry Osborne, an Air Force veteran. Susan quickly began to like Osborne, and he was wonderful with Evan, who didn't have a relationship with his birth father. After about a year, the pair were married on January 25th, 2014, and Susan and Evan moved into the Holtville home that Osborne had purchased prior to their marriage. Although Susan's friends and family said that initially Osborne seemed nice and down to earth, in hindsight there were a lot of red flags. In fact, at the time that Susan and Evan went missing, Susan's family had only met him a few times. By 2015, Susan had begun to distance herself from her family, and they would later find out that it was because Osborne was listening to all of her phone calls. The last time Susan's brother Brian and his wife Missy saw Susan and the kids in person was in January of 2015, when Susan, Osborne, and the kids came to visit her ill father. The group had planned to go ice fishing, but shortly before they were all supposed to meet back up, Susan sent a text saying that they had to go back to Alabama. Missy went on to say that they didn't even get a chance to say a proper goodbye. In 2016, Susan confided to her friend Holly that she had discovered Osborne was having affairs with other men. She'd found a photo of him along with an ad on Craigslist, and numerous emails between him and the other men. Susan told Holly that she was getting a plan together to leave, and she needed a job so the kids could have insurance and a place to live. Holly expressed her concern for Susan and the kids' safety on numerous occasions and encouraged Susan to leave. However, this plan would never come to fruition, as Susan would later tell Holly that they had worked through their issues. Susan's mother, Linda, came to Alabama to visit with Susan and the kids for Mother's Day weekend in 2017, and by all accounts, it was a nice, enjoyable visit. On May 16, 2017, Susan and Osborne helped Holly and her fiancé finish packing for their move to Key West before seeing them off. After Holly left, Susan called to find out whether she had had her mail forwarded and offered to pick it up until Holly could get settled. Susan's daughter lived with her father during this period, and Susan had visitation rights. On May 26, 2017, Susan saw her daughter for the last time. That same day, she called Holly to tell her that Evan had missed school because he was sick and asked if it was okay for her to send her mail the following Tuesday, since Monday was Memorial Day. Susan and Holly spoke regularly and had a casual phone conversation on May 28, 2017, and exchanged a few texts on May 29th. These would be the last known communications with Susan. Investigators have stated that there's been no activity on Susan or Evan's phone since May 29th of 2017. Over the next month, Susan's family and Holly would continue to try and reach Susan and Evan with no success, and by July their phones had been disconnected. Neither Susan's family nor Holly had a number for Osborne. Linda even tried to mail a letter to her daughter, but it was returned as undeliverable in July. Everyone had begun to worry about Susan and Evan, but they all described Susan as a private person, and no one wanted to upset her by calling the police. However, when Susan's family contacted Holly and a friend of Evan's from school and discovered that no one else had spoken to them, they contacted the police, and a missing persons report was filed with the Elmore County Sheriff's Office on July 29th. The following Monday, July 31st, 2017, Captain Chris Ogden and Lieutenant Troy Evans of the Elmore County Sheriff's Office went to the Osborne home to perform a welfare check. When they arrived, they found Susan's vehicle in the driveway. When Osborne answered the door, he stated that he had been cleaning. The investigators noted a strong smell of incense, and that Osborne also had a burn barrel going in the backyard. The investigators entered, and Osborne told them that he and Susan had a fight on Memorial Day, and that she and Evan had left with an unknown man in a truck. Osborne thought they were headed to Birmingham. Even though Osborne claimed the man never got out of the vehicle, he described the man in detail. Around 6 feet tall, with a beard and sunglasses. He would later add that when he left to visit his parents, Susan and Evan returned and removed all their belongings, and Susan had vandalized the home by spray painting vulgarities on the floors and the walls. Captain Ogden walked out back with Osborne to look at the burn barrel in the backyard, while Lieutenant Evans remained in the home. Lieutenant Evans stated that while he was waiting, he noticed the bottom of the walls had been poorly painted. He scanned the room and saw an open pantry with several 5-gallon buckets of paint on the floor. After they finished speaking with Osborne, they left the home. Holly called the investigators that afternoon and gave them all the information that she had. Between what was observed in the home during the welfare check and Holly's conversation, they obtained a search warrant the same day and returned to the house. During the search, Osborne admitted to burning some of Evan's belongings, including his bed. They noted the home had undergone a fairly significant remodel, and they knew from speaking with Linda that the home had hardwood floors at the time she visited in May, but at some point after that, Osborne had installed carpeting, painted, scrapped his old security system, and installed a new home security system with cameras. They also located several burn piles in the backyard. Using luminol, they discovered blood evidence, which Sheriff Bill Franklin described as indicative that something violent had occurred, not something along the lines of a finger cut. In that same interview, Sheriff Franklin confirmed they had seized electronics from the home. Although he wouldn't state exactly what was on the computer they had seized, he did say the search history was not one a typical person would have. Unfortunately, it turned out that the blood samples taken from the home were too degraded to prepare a DNA profile. Throughout the investigation, it was discovered that Osborne's father had taken Sugar and Schnook to an animal shelter on June 1st, 2017, and even told an employee that Sugar's name was Susan. Osborne had begun purchasing supplies to remodel the home by June 4th, and on July 1st, 37 days after Susan and Evan disappeared, Osborne filed for divorce. The divorce was ultimately granted on November 15, 2017, after his attorney filed a motion for default judgment. Osborne continued to pay child support to the father of Susan's daughter and kept her on his insurance for at least a year. After Susan and Evan had disappeared, there are inconsistencies in Osborne's story. For example, he changed the type of vehicle in which Susan and Evan left, as well as the color of the spray paint she allegedly used to vandalize the home. Susan's family and friends fear the worst, as they claim there's no way Susan would have willingly left her daughter behind. Quote, "She wouldn't just disappear. She wouldn't have left her 10-year-old daughter. She wouldn't go without talking to her and seeing her," end quote, said Holly Morris. The investigation into Susan and Evan's disappearance is still ongoing. Multiple areas around the home and nearby have been searched several times. Although Sheriff Franklin has stated that Jerry Osborne is a person of interest, and the only person of interest, he's never been arrested or charged in connection with Susan and Evan's disappearance. Osborne continues to maintain that he had nothing to do with the case. Number 2. Ashley Summers, Cleveland, Ohio. Ashley Nicole Summers was born June 16, 1993, and grew up in the midst of a large extended family in Cleveland, Ohio. Ashley is the oldest child and often took care of her siblings, while her mom, Jennifer, was at work. Family members say that while growing up, Ashley loved making people laugh and acting silly. She's described as outgoing, talkative, and enthusiast of scary movies. While she was definitely a fun-loving adolescent, she also had a very strong personality and would act on what she felt was right. Ashley's biological father was not involved in her life, but she grew up around her mother's huge extended family, who provided the support and community she needed. Ashley's family noticed a drastic change in her personality around the time of her 14th birthday. She became difficult and oppositional, particularly towards her mother and her mother's long-term boyfriend, who helped raise Ashley. Around this same time, Ashley began dating a 16-year-old boy named Anne Gil, who lived near her house. Because Ashley often had to stay home to watch her younger siblings while her mom was at work, Ashley would invite Jean over to the house during this time, without her mother's knowledge. Ashley's mother, Jennifer Summers, only found out about this routine when one of Ashley's younger brothers brought it to her attention. Jennifer wasn't happy about this being done behind her back, and she prohibited him from visiting the house, which caused tensions to rise even further. The tipping point in the household arose when Jennifer found that Ashley had stolen money from her purse to get a tattoo of her boyfriend's name at 13 years old. Unable to reason with Ashley, in an attempt to diffuse the tension and de-escalate the conflict in the relationship, Jennifer Summers asked her own mother, who lives 4 miles away, to take Ashley in for the summer. Jennifer thought Ashley would be on her best behavior for her grandmother, and that the space may ease the strain in their relationship. In addition to staying with her grandmother, Ashley bounced around between family members who lived in the area during the day while her grandmother was at work, but she checked in with her mother every day on the phone. In the days before her disappearance, Ashley stayed at her Uncle Kevin's house, which wasn't unusual as a lot of her cousins hung out there. Ashley was last seen on July 9th, 2007, after leaving a pool party at her uncle's house in Cleveland, Ohio, near the 2100 block of West 96th Street. Attendees of the party described Ashley being in a somber mood when she arrived, but that she became more joyful as she got in the pool and talked to her relatives. Ashley left the party early, at around 6 p.m., hugging her granduncle Keith and informing relatives that she'd be walking to her aunt's house to stay. Ashley had all of her clothes with her, but no cell phone. Her aunt's house was just a 10-minute walk, but Ashley never arrived. Ashley did own a cell phone, but it was no longer working. Her cell being broken could also explain her somber mood at the party. Earlier in the day, before the pool party at Uncle Keith's, another one of Ashley's uncles, Kevin Donathan, destroyed her phone after an argument. According to Kevin, he overheard Ashley gossiping about the family on her phone, and it ultimately ended in him smashing her phone. Ashley was known for escaping to family members' houses to spend the night, but when Jennifer didn't hear from her daughter for 2 days, she became very concerned. She called Kevin Donathan's house to see if Ashley was there, and he said he hadn't seen her since before the pool party. Jennifer Summers knew that Ashley wasn't at her mother's house, so she began calling around to other relatives, with no luck. Beginning to panic, Jennifer Summers went to the police to report Ashley missing. Suspecting that Ashley ran away voluntarily, despite Jennifer's protests, police designate Ashley as an endangered runaway. Disappointed in the response from the police, Jennifer Summers and family organized search parties and posted flyers around town, hoping to elicit tips or communication from Ashley. Mysteriously, all of the flyers were ripped down within a day, though few tips were submitted. Sources vary on the exact date of Ashley's disappearance, ranging from July 4th to July 9th, 2007. Most sources report Ashley's last known location to be near the 2100 block of West 96th Street on July 9th. But one source reports that the FBI now believes that Ashley's last known location was near the area of West 44th Street and Towbridge Avenue in Cleveland on July 8th, 2007. 4 weeks after Ashley's disappearance, Jennifer Summers received a call at work from a blocked number. The voice on the other end said, "Mom, it's me, I'm okay, don't worry," before hanging up the phone. Jennifer said that it sounded like Ashley, but she couldn't be sure. Later that year, November 17th, 2007, Ashley's grandparents claimed to have seen her walking along West 44th Street in Cleveland, but she was gone by the time they turned the car around. The woman they saw had short blonde hair, which matched tips they had received, and they believed it was Ashley. Sadly, neither of these occurrences led to any valuable information. The FBI became involved in Ashley's case around May of 2008, when the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children brought the case to their attention. The FBI Cleveland Division started to wonder if Ashley's case could be connected to other missing girls who disappeared from the Cleveland area. Amanda Berry disappeared April 21st, 2003, at the age of 16, while walking home from her job at Burger King. And Georgina DeJesus, age 14, disappeared while walking home from school on April 2nd, 2004. Amanda Berry, Georgina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight were found safe on May 6, 2013, after Amanda Berry escaped Ariel Castro with the help of neighbors, ending nearly 10 years of captivity. The Cleveland women had all been lured into his car, made easier by the fact that they knew Castro's daughters. Rumors spread that Ashley may have once been in the house, but authorities couldn't find any evidence of her ever being there. Castro was sentenced to life in prison plus 1,000 years. However, just 1 month into his sentence, Ariel Castro hanged himself in his cell, ending all hope that he could provide answers for Ashley's disappearance. Anne Gil, Ashley's older boyfriend, was out of town at a family reunion at the time of Ashley's disappearance. Police interviewed Gene multiple times, and his story remained consistent. Taking his alibi into consideration, along with his consistent story and lack of suspicion, authorities never named Anne Gil as a person of interest. Ashley's family was interrogated and given polygraph tests, but the results have never been released. Authorities were particularly interested in Ashley's older male relatives, specifically Kevin Donathan, who fought with Ashley on the day of her disappearance. Ultimately, Ashley's case remained stagnant, but a glimmer of hope appeared in January of 2015 when a woman was photographed on an ATM security camera inside of a car on Rhode Island. The Summers family contacted the Cleveland FBI to report that a woman in a photo, released by the Warwick Police Department, bore a striking resemblance to Ashley, who would have been 21 years old at the time. The photo was released in an attempt to identify two people suspected of running an ATM and identity fraud scheme. The police has confirmed that it is not Ashley in the photos. A more recent development, which may or may not be related to Ashley's disappearance, involves her uncle, Kevin Donathan, who Ashley had had an argument with on the day of her disappearance. Kevin Donathan pled not guilty to charges of rape, attempted rape, and gross sexual imposition on December 4, 2018, in addition to gross sexual misconduct of several minors. The 55-year-old admitted to crimes that happened over a span of 25 years, and he was sentenced to 35 years in prison. February of 2020, around 1 month before Kevin Donathan was arrested, on November 8, 2018, the FBI led a hands-on search of the back of his home in Holmdel. Despite this search, the FBI has never officially named Kevin Donathan as a suspect in Ashley's disappearance. On April 13, 2021, the FBI dug up land in connection with Ashley's disappearance in the area of West 43rd Street and Train Avenue in Cleveland, based on new tips. However, only animal bones were found. In the time since she vanished, a few additional potential locations have been identified by authorities, including the 1100 block of Holmdel Avenue and the 3400 block of West 44th Street. Ashley's social media presence and phone activity ceased on the day of her disappearance, and there have been no confirmed sightings of Ashley since July 9, 2007. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Ashley Summers, please contact Cleveland Police Department, Ohio, at 216-623-5005. Again, that's 216-623-5005. And that number will be posted at the top of this video's description. Number 1. Jane Wakefield. Jane Wakefield was a celebrated teacher who loved her friends and family and was relying on them during her divorce to James Wakefield in the summer of 1975. She was with her friends all day on September the 6th on a cross-country bike ride, but ended up going back to her new home, a motor lodge, for a quote, appointment. She was living in the trailer park pending her divorce, while James kept their once shared apartment in town. After an extended bike ride with her friends, she returned to her mobile home that evening. That night, a neighbor allegedly heard screams coming from the direction of Jane's home, but didn't call police because he wasn't sure if he had actually heard trouble. Later that night, someone in a local motel reported hearing a conversation through a wall, something along the lines of, quote, "We'll get rid of her the same way we did back in Iowa City, in a sewage lagoon," unquote. Officials drained a nearby pond to search for evidence, but found nothing. When she failed to report to work Monday, police investigated her home and saw her bike tethered securely, her car parked in its spot, and all of her personal effects in the residence. There was no further progress on her case until January of 1976, when a confidential informant later told police that her soon-to-be ex-husband, John, had rented a car similar to her current boyfriend's and arrived at Jane's home in the evening. According to the informant, he abducted her and put her in the trunk of his rental car, and then used an industrial-scale incinerator to cremate her body. He had access to such equipment through one of his businesses, something that he and Jane were actively settling how to divide during the divorce. He then allegedly spread her ashes over I-40 in the middle of the night, depositing most of them in a rest stop trash can. Because of this tip, police obtained a search warrant for the Wakefield's businesses and found bone chips, as well as a gold filling in the base of the incinerator. Tests on the bone fragments were inconclusive and greatly limited due to the lack of forensic technologies in the 70s. John Wakefield was never charged or convicted due to lack of evidence, and according to authorities, is no longer considered a suspect. But he has always been suspected by Jane's friends and family. On September 5, 1982, Jane is officially declared deceased, although she nor her remains have ever been found. Jane was born November 19, 1948, and that would have made her 26 at the time she went missing. Her age today would be 74. She was a Caucasian female, 5 foot 2 inches tall, weighed 112 pounds with brown hair when she vanished. Number 2. Kathleen Henson, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Kathleen was a beloved mother who worked at a local record store. She loved music and concerts, and when the opportunity came up for her to share some tickets with her friends, she offered to deliver them to their residence. On the evening of the 23rd, Kathleen and Royce left her place of work, Rogers Records, en route to drop off some concert tickets. After she left work, she and Royce seemingly vanished into thin air. Here's what we know. On March 23, 1979, Kathleen drops her son Eamon off at his father's home while she goes to work for a few hours. The plan is that Eamon would stay only at his father's home for a few hours and then return to Kathleen's home once she's finished with work. She and Royce leave the record store, but not before Kathleen calls her friends and tells them that she can come to their home and bring them some concert tickets. She calls her friend from the record store, which places her approximate time leaving at around 11:30. Eamon's father drops him off to Kathleen's home, without realizing that she isn't there. Eamon finds a way into the house and assumes that Kathleen would be in later that night or in the morning. On the morning of March 24th, Eamon wakes to find that Kathleen is still not home and calls her best friend to report her absence. Her friend then calls Kathleen's parents, who report her as missing and start to search for her. The next day, on March 25th, Kathleen's car is found abandoned at an intersection in town. It's parked crookedly and fully locked, with no windows open. The vehicle, which is a brown 1969 Chrysler sedan, was loaned from her father. Inside the vehicles, authorities locate her purse, with her credit cards and Social Security card inside. There's one baby bottle for Royce, but no diaper or baby clothes. There were no signs of a struggle in the car or in the surrounding area, and her home was also free of clues about her potential abductor. She didn't appear to have packed any extra clothes for herself or Royce, or extra money or food. No sign of Kathleen or Royce have ever been found, and no suspects have ever been named or charged in their disappearances. Number 3. Kristen Richardson, Muskogee, Oklahoma. Kristen Richardson was the type of person who would go out of her way to help others. Her friends believe that her charity might have led to her death, and potentially at the hands of those close to her. Kristen went missing on May 25, 2018, the day she was to leave for Rocklahoma, an annual multi-day music festival in Pryor, Oklahoma. Kristen was a lover of music and an avid drummer with the nickname Crash. Her favorite band, Hailstorm, was playing in Rocklahoma that year, so she was excited to see them. She had notified a longtime family friend that she was stopping by to pick up a sleeping bag and tent, but they never heard from her again. Family and friends say that Kristen would not just disappear. She had a dog named Buddy, and she would never leave him or her home, friends, or family. Carl Bryce, Kristen's roommate, claims that he and Kristen went to Rocklahoma, and she left with an unknown female. However, cell tower data indicates that Kristen's cell phone never left the area near her home, and no one reported seeing her at the festival outside of her roommate. Carl Bryce and Cody Ray Campbell, Kristen's other roommate, were briefly held as material witnesses in her case. Bryce had used Kristen's Oklahoma access card after her disappearance, and Campbell allegedly told people he was involved in the death of Kristen. Both men had sold and given away her property before she was actually reported missing. Campbell has been sentenced for theft charges, and Bryce is facing charges in connection with a stolen truck discovered at the residence. But neither have been charged in her disappearance. Several years later, there is still no trace of Kristen, and her case is still in active investigation by the Muskogee Police Department. Kristen, also known as Crash to her friends, was 51 at the time of her disappearance. She's described as a Native American female, 5 foot 6 inches tall, approximately 180 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes. If anyone has information related to her disappearance, they are encouraged to contact the police department at 918-683-8000. Number 4. Morgan Bauer. On February 27, 2016, 19-year-old Morgan Bauer embarked on a journey from her small hometown of Aberdeen, South Dakota, to the bustling city of Atlanta, Georgia. Full of hopes and dreams, she sought independence and a fresh start. Little did she know that this leap of faith would thrust her into an enigmatic and unsettling disappearance. Accompanied by a friend, she traveled to Minnesota before catching a flight to the bustling metropolis. Her mother, Sherry Sitch-Miller, had reservations about the move but gave in, recognizing Morgan's determination to explore new horizons. Upon arriving in Atlanta, Morgan had arranged to stay with a man that she had met through Craigslist. In exchange for rent, she offered to assist with household chores until she could find employment. However, her plans took a turn when she was unexpectedly asked to leave the temporary residence. Refusing to return home defeated, Morgan sought refuge in a local motel and began exploring different avenues to sustain herself financially. Facing difficulty securing stable employment, Morgan turned to dancing at local clubs, although the specific venues where she worked remains undisclosed. It is known that she encountered obstacles due to missing paperwork required for such employment. Sherry expressed concerns over her daughter's circumstances, recognizing the challenges faced by young adults striving to make their mark. Morgan, known for her active presence on social media and constant communication with her best friend, abruptly went silent. She stopped responding to her family and friends, and her last activity on Snapchat was recorded on the night of her disappearance. Attempts to reach her via phone have been unsuccessful, with her device either turned off or out of power. Alarmed by her daughter's sudden disappearance, Sherry filed a missing persons report with the Atlanta Police Department on March 12, 2016. Investigators initiated an inquiry into Morgan's case, expressing their commitment to ensuring her safety and well-being. While foul play is not currently suspected, the police remain dedicated to uncovering the truth behind her vanishing act. Sherry and her husband traveled to Atlanta to launch an intensive search for their daughter. They distributed flyers bearing her photo throughout the city, appealing to the public for any information that might lead to her whereabouts. The family's plea for assistance gained widespread attention, with numerous online communities rallying to support their cause. Despite the outpouring of support, the family faced the harsh reality of online rumors and hurtful comments. Sherry implored that people focus on the urgency of finding Morgan, rather than engaging in speculation or blame. Morgan Bauer is described as 5 foot 6 inches tall, weighing approximately 125 pounds, with long brown hair and piercing blue eyes. She has distinctive features such as gauged ears and 2 lip piercings. Morgan also bears several tattoos, including a sun and moon on her chest, and an anchor on her left wrist, and a jellyfish on her arm. The Atlanta Police Missing Persons Unit continues to investigate her case, urging anyone with information to come forward and assist in the search for Morgan. Additionally, the family has set up a 24-hour tip line at 1-855-MORGAN-B for anyone with relevant information to come forward. Morgan Bauer remains missing, and the search for her continues. Number 5. Ina Arnol, Oklahoma. Ina M. Arnol was last seen leaving her home in Powhatan, Oklahoma, with plans to travel more than 100 miles to visit her daughter in Tulsa on May 28, 1981. She never arrived in Tulsa and has not been seen or heard from since. Ina's car, a diesel-powered, 4-door 1980 Oldsmobile, was found the following day in a parking lot at the Tulsa airport in Tulsa by her daughter. Authorities didn't find anything in or around the car that led them to believe that foul play may have been involved in Ina's disappearance. Today, it's been more than 41 years since Ina was last seen leaving her home. Her case remains unsolved, and authorities have considered her case to be cold. Since a short time after her disappearance, authorities have announced their belief that Ina left on her own accord. They believe that she may have traveled to San Francisco, California, or Nevada sometime after her disappearance. At the time she went missing, she was described as a 46-year-old Caucasian woman with brown hair and gray eyes. She was between 4'11" and 5 foot 2 inches tall and weighed around 90 to 110 pounds. Ina has stretch marks on her abdomen and wears full upper dentures. She may use the last name Creetland. She was last seen wearing a purple skirt, pantyhose, a half-slip, a multicolored blouse, and brown sandals. She was also wearing her diamond dinner ring, a diamond wedding set, a diamond watch, a diamond bracelet, and possibly an off-white colored raincoat. If you have any information regarding her disappearance or her whereabouts, please contact the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation at 580-298-5525. Number 6. Lisa Irwin. Lisa Irwin was only 11 months old when she vanished from her Kansas City, Missouri home on October 4th, 2011. She was born on November 11th, 2010 to her parents, Deborah Bradley and Jeremy Irwin, and has 2 older brothers. The day Lisa went missing on October 3rd, 2011, Jeremy returns home around 2:30 p.m. from his job as an electrician. He watched the kids while Deborah got some rest. Around 4:45 p.m., Deborah and her brother are seen on surveillance footage going to a supermarket. They are seen shopping around the store and purchasing baby food and boxed wine. While Deborah was at the grocery store, Samantha Brando, a next-door neighbor and friend of the family, checked on Lisa in her crib along with her young daughter. Jeremy is home also with the kids. By 5 p.m., Deborah and her brother returned home. A half hour later, Jeremy got a call for a night gig doing electrical work at a local Starbucks. It was rare that Jeremy was called in for night shifts, but the family needed the money. He told Deborah he planned to return home by 10 p.m. Deborah put baby Lisa to bed around 6:40 p.m. Samantha came over and the two sat on the porch, smoking cigarettes and drinking, while their other children played. By 10:30 p.m., Samantha leaves and Deborah's 2 boys fall asleep in her bed. Earlier that day, Deborah found a stray kitten, which she took in. Before Deborah herself went to bed, she placed all 3 cell phones on the kitchen counter, which were shut off due to non-payment. Samantha was on the porch until 11:30, chatting with another neighbor. However, according to phone records, at 11:57 p.m., a call was attempted from one of the 3 phones left on the counter to a woman named Megan. Strangely, Deborah and Jeremy don't know a woman named Megan. Detectives looked back at the phone records and couldn't find a connection between Jeremy and Deborah to a Megan. An eyewitness claims that a person who lived in the same house as Megan picked up her phone. This witness was never identified, and it was believed he gave authorities a fake name. When Lisa is discovered missing, Jeremy returns home from his night gig around 3:30 a.m. Upon entering his home, he was annoyed to find most of the lights were left on. Jeremy took note of some oddities in the home. He noticed that Deborah took in a stray kitten. The front door was unlocked and the computer room window was pushed in. He then proceeds to check on his wife and children and notices that Lisa is not in her crib. Lisa's parents check the entire house, with the exception of the backyard, because Deborah was afraid of what she might find. Once Lisa was reported missing, a witness came forward with new information. While the witness's name was never made public, they told officials that they saw a man walking with a baby around 4 a.m. The witness recalls that morning being very cold and that Lisa was not dressed appropriately for the cold weather, which they found suspicious. On October 6, 2011, police responded to a nearby dumpster fire only a few blocks from the Irwin residence. There was evidence of burnt baby clothes found inside the dumpster. While the articles of clothing did not match what Lisa was wearing the night she went missing, law enforcement believes it could be other clothing that Lisa owned. Law enforcement has not confirmed if this incident is directly related to Lisa's case. The following day, Deborah took a polygraph test. She is told that she failed, but it is later revealed that this was just an interrogation tactic, because police couldn't establish if she was connected to Lisa's disappearance. On October 17, 2011, the FBI executed a search warrant on the home. Cadaver dogs were also brought in and identified as a positive location of remains in Irwin's bedroom. Law enforcement also obtained several items, including a multicolored comforter, purple shorts, a multicolored Disney character shirt, a glow-worm toy, a Cars-themed blanket, rolls of tape, and a tape dispenser. They were also taking carpet samples and digging up the backyard. Oddly enough, in May 2012, Jeremy's debit card was used on a website known for name-changing services. It was a British website, and he was charged $69.04. It's speculated that this website can be used to purchase birth certificates. Lisa's case remains unsolved. Her parents, while they have been considered persons of interest, have not been formally charged in connection to Lisa's disappearance. George Sauter was born with the name Giorgio Sadu in Tulla, Sardinia, Italy in 1895. He immigrated to the United States 13 years later, with an older brother who went back home as soon as both boys had cleared customs at Ellis Island. For the rest of his life, George, as he came to be known, would not talk about why he had left his homeland. Sauter eventually found work on the railroads in Pennsylvania, carrying water and other supplies to workers. After a few years, he took more permanent work as a driver in Smithers, West Virginia. He then started his own trucking company, initially hauling fill dirt to construction sites and later hauling coal mined in the region. He soon met and married Jenny Cipriani, a storekeeper's daughter in Smithers who had also immigrated from Italy in her childhood. The Sauters settled outside nearby Fayetteville, which had a large population of Italian immigrants, in a 2-story timber frame house just 2 miles north of town. In 1923, they had the first of their 10 children. George's business prospered, and they became one of the most respected middle-class families around, in the words of one local official. However, George had strong opinions about many subjects and wasn't shy about expressing them, sometimes alienating people. In particular, his strident opposition to Italian dictator Benito Mussolini had led to some strong arguments with other members of the immigrant community. The last of the Sauter children, Sylvia, was born in 1942. By then, their second oldest son, Joe, had left home to serve in the military during World War II. The following year, Mussolini was deposed and executed. However, George's criticism of the late dictator had left some hard feelings. In October 1945, a visiting life insurance salesman, after being rebuffed, warned George that his house would go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed, attributing this to all the dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini. Another visitor to the house, seeking work, took the occasion to go around to the back and warned George that a pair of fuse boxes might cause a fire someday. George was puzzled by the observation, since he had just had the house rewired when an electric stove was installed, and the local electric company had said afterwards that it was completely safe. In the weeks before Christmas that year, George's older sons had noticed a strange car parked along the main highway through town, its occupants watching the younger Sodder children as they returned from school. The Sodder family celebrated Christmas Eve in 1945. Marion, 19, the oldest daughter, had been working at a dime store in downtown Fayetteville, and she surprised 3 of her younger sisters, Martha, 12, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, with new toys that she had bought for them as gifts. The younger children were so excited that they asked their mother if they could stay up past what had been their usual bedtime. At 10 p.m., Jenny told them they could stay up a little later, as long as the 2 oldest boys, who were still awake, 14-year-old Maurice and his 9-year-old brother Louis, remembered to put the cows in and feed the chickens before going to bed themselves. George and his 2 oldest boys, John, 22, and George Jr., 16, who had spent the day working with their father, were already asleep. After reminding the children of those remaining chores, she took Sylvia, 2 at the time, upstairs with her, and they went to bed together. The telephone rang at 12:30 a.m. Jenny woke and went downstairs to answer it. The caller was a woman whose voice that she didn't recognize, asking for a name that she wasn't familiar with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses in the background. Jenny told the caller that she had reached a wrong number, later recalling the woman's weird laugh. She hung up and returned to bed. As she did, she noticed that the lights were still on and the curtains weren't drawn, 2 things the children normally attended to when they stayed up later than their parents. Marion had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room, so Jenny assumed the other children who had stayed up later had gone back up to the attic where they slept. She closed the curtains, turned out the lights, and returned to bed herself. At 1 a.m., Jenny was again awakened by the sound of an object hitting the house's roof with a loud bang, and then a rolling noise. After hearing nothing further, she went back to sleep. After another half hour, she woke up again, smelling smoke. When she got up again, she found that the room George used for his office was on fire, around the telephone line and fuse box. Jenny woke him, and he in turn woke his older sons. Both parents and 2 of their children, Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr., escaped the house. They frantically yelled to the children upstairs but heard no response. They couldn't go up there, as the stairway itself was already aflame. John said in his first police interview, after the fire he went up to the attic to alert his siblings sleeping there, though he later changed his story to say that he only called up there and didn't actually see them. Efforts to find aid and rescue the children were unexpectedly complicated. The phone didn't work, so Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the Fayetteville Fire Department. A driver on a nearby road had also seen the flames and called from a nearby tavern. They too were unsuccessful, either because they couldn't reach the operator or because the phone there had turned out to have been broken. Either the neighbor or the passing motorist was eventually successful in reaching the fire department from another phone in the center of town. George, barefoot, attempted to climb the house's outside wall and broke open a window, cutting his arm in the process. He and his sons intended to use a ladder to the attic to rescue the other children, but it wasn't in its usual spot, resting against the house, and couldn't be found anywhere nearby. A water barrel that could have been used to extinguish the fire was frozen solid. George then tried to pull both of the trucks he used in his business up to the house and use them to climb to the attic window, but neither of them would start despite having worked perfectly during the previous day. Frustrated, the 6 Sodders who had escaped had no choice but to watch the house burn down and collapse over the next 45 minutes, They assumed the other 5 children had perished in the blaze. The fire department, low on manpower due to the war and relying on individual firefighters to call each other, didn't respond until later that morning. Chief F.J. Morris said the next day that the already slow response was further hampered by his inability to drive the fire truck, requiring that he was to wait until someone who could drive was available. The firefighters, one of whom was a brother of Jenny's, could do little but look through the ashes that were left in the Sodders' basement. By 10 a.m., Morris told the Sodders that they hadn't found any bones, as might have been expected if the other children had been in the house as it burned. According to another account, they did find a few bone fragments and internal organs, but chose not to tell the family. It has also been noted by modern fire professionals that their search was cursory at best. Nevertheless, Morris believed that the 5 children unaccounted for had died in the fire, suggesting it had been hot enough to burn their bodies completely. Morris told George to leave the site undisturbed, so that the state fire marshal's office could conduct a more thorough investigation. However, after 4 days, George and his wife couldn't bear the site anymore, so he bulldozed 5 feet of dirt over the site with the intention of converting it to a memorial garden for the lost children. The local coroner convened an inquest the next day, which held that the fire was an accident caused by faulty wiring. Among the jurors was the man that had threatened George that his house would be burned down and his children destroyed in retribution for his anti-Mussolini remarks. Death certificates for the 5 children were issued December 30th. The local newspaper contradicted itself, stating that all the bodies had been found, but then later in the same story reporting that only part of one body was recovered. George and Jenny were too grief-stricken to attend the funeral on January 2nd, 1946, although their surviving children did. Not long afterwards, as they began to rebuild their lives, the Sodder family started to question all the official findings about the fire. They wondered why, if it had been caused by an electrical problem, the family's Christmas lights had remained on throughout the fire's early stages, when the power should have gone out. Then they found the ladder that had been missing from the side of the house on the night of the fire at the bottom of an embankment, 75 feet away. A telephone repairman told the Sodders that the house's phone line had not been burned through in the fire, as they had initially thought, but cut by someone who had been willing and able to climb 14 feet up the pole and reach 2 feet away from it to do so. A man who neighbors had seen stealing a block and tackle from the property around the time of the fire was identified and arrested. He admitted to the theft and claimed he had been the one who cut the phone line, thinking it was a power line, but denied having anything to do with the fire. However, no record identifying the suspect exists, and why would he have wanted to cut any utility lines to the Sodder house while stealing the block and tackle has never been explained. Jenny said in 1968 that if he had cut the power line, she and her husband, along with the 4 other children, would never have been able to make it out of the house. Jenny also had trouble accepting Morris's belief that all traces of the children's bodies had been burned away completely in the fire. Many of the household appliances had been found, still recognizable in the ash, along with fragments of the tin roof. She contrasted the result of the fire with a newspaper account of a similar house fire that she read around the same time that killed a family of 7. Skeletal remains of all the victims were reported to have been found in that case. Jenny burned small piles of animal bones to see if they would ever be completely consumed. None ever were. An employee of a local crematorium she contacted told her that human bones remain even after the bodies are burned at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours, far longer and far hotter than the house fire could have been. The Sodders' truck's failure to start was also considered. George believed they had been tampered with, perhaps by the same man who stole the block and tackle and cut the phone line. However, one of George's son-in-laws told the Charleston Gazette-Mail in 2013 that he had come to believe that Sodder and his sons might have, in their haste to start the trucks, inadvertently flooded the engines. Some accounts have suggested that the wrong number phone call to the Sodder house might have also been connected to the fire. However, investigators later located the woman who had made the call. She confirmed it was just the wrong number on her part. As spring approached, the Sodders, as they said they would, planted flowers in the soil bulldozed over the house. Jenny tended it carefully for the rest of her life. However, further developments in early 1946 reinforced the family's belief that the children they were memorializing might, in fact, still be alive somewhere. Evidence soon emerged indicating that the fire had not started in the electrical fault and was rather set deliberately. The driver of a bus that passed through Fayetteville late Christmas Eve said he had seen some people throwing balls of fire at the house. A few months later, when the snow had melted, Sylvia found a small, hard, dark green rubber ball-like object in the brush nearby. George, recalling his wife's account of a loud thump on the roof before the fire, said it looked like a pineapple bomb, a hand grenade, or some other incendiary device used in combat. The family later claimed that, contrary to the fire marshal's conclusion, the fire had started on the roof, although by then there was no way to prove it. Other witnesses claimed to have seen the missing Sodder children themselves. One woman who had been watching the fire from the road said that she had seen some of them peering out of a passing car while the house was burning. Another woman at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston said that she had served them breakfast the next morning and noted the presence of a car with a Florida license plate in the rest stop's parking lot as well. The Sodders hired a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley from the nearby town of Golly Bridge to look into the case. Tinsley informed the family that the insurance salesman who had threatened George over his anti-Mussolini sentiments had been on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire an accident. He also learned of rumors around Fayetteville that despite his report to the Sodders that no remains had been found in the ashes, Morris had found a heart, which he later packed into a metal box and secretly buried. Morris had apparently confessed this to a local minister, who in turn confirmed it to George. George and Tinsley went to Morris and confronted him with this news. Morris agreed to show the two where he had buried the metal box, and they dug it up. They took what they found inside to a local funeral director, who, after examining it, told them that it was, in reality, fresh beef liver that had never been exposed to fire. Later, more rumors circulated around Fayetteville that Morris had afterwards admitted the box with the liver had indeed not come from the fire originally. He had supposedly placed it there in the hope that the Sodders would find it and be satisfied that the missing children had indeed died in the fire. On one occasion, George saw a magazine photo of a group of young ballet dancers in New York City, one of whom looked like his missing daughter Betty. He drove all the way to the girls' school, where his repeated demands to see the girl himself were refused. George had also tried to interest the Federal Bureau of Investigation in investigating what he considered a kidnapping. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally responded to his letters. He wrote, "Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of a local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this Bureau." End quote. If the local authorities requested the Bureau's assistance, he added, he would of course direct agents to assist, but the Fayetteville Police and Fire Department declined to do so. In August of 1949, George was able to persuade Oscar Hunter, a Washington, D.C. pathologist, to supervise a new search through the dirt at the house site. After a very thorough search, artifacts, including a dictionary that had belonged to the children and some coins, were found. Several small bone fragments were unearthed, determined to have been human vertebrae. The bone fragments were sent to Marshall T. Newman, a specialist at the Smithsonian Institution. They were confirmed to be lumbar vertebrae, all from the same person. Since the transverse recesses are fused, the age of this individual at death should have been 16 or 17 years old, Newman's report said. The top limit of age should be about 22, since the centra, which normally fuse at 23, are still infused, end quote. Thus, given this age range, it was not very likely that these bones were from any of the 5 missing children, since the oldest, Maurice, had been 14 at the time. Newman added that the bones showed no sign of exposure to flame. Further, he agreed that it was very strange that those bones were the only ones found, since a wood fire of such short duration would have left full skeletons of all the children behind. The report concluded that the vertebrae had instead most likely come from the dirt that George had used to bulldoze the site. Later, Tinsley supposedly confirmed that the bone fragments had come from a cemetery in nearby Mount Hope, but couldn't explain why they had been taken from there or how they came to be at the fire site. The Smithsonian returned the bone fragments to George in September of 1949. According to its records, their current location is unknown. The investigation and its findings attracted national attention, and the West Virginia legislature held 2 hearings on the case in 1950. Afterwards, however, Governor O.K. Patterson and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett told the Sodders that the case was hopeless and closed it at the state level. The FBI decided it had jurisdiction as a possible interstate kidnapping, but dropped the case after 2 years of following fruitless leads. With the end of official efforts to resolve the case, the Sodder family didn't give up hope. They had flyers printed up with pictures of the children, offering a $5,000 reward, soon doubled, for information that would have settled the case for even one of them. In 1952, they put up a billboard at the side of the house and another along U.S. Route 60 near Ansted with the same information. It would, in time, become a landmark for traffic through Fayetteville on U.S. Route 19, today State Route 16. The family's efforts soon brought another reported sighting of the children after the fire. Ida Crutchfield, a woman who ran a Charleston hotel, claimed to have seen the children approximately a week afterwards. Quote, "I don't remember the exact date," she said in a statement. "The children had come in around midnight with 2 men and 2 women, all of whom appeared to be of Italian extraction," end quote. When she attempted to speak with the children, she said, "One of the men looked at me in a hostile manner. He turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking to me," end quote. She recalled that they left the hotel early the next morning. Investigators today do not, however, consider her story credible, as she had only first seen photos of the children 2 years after the fire and 5 years before she came forward. George followed up leads in person, traveling to the areas from where tips had come. A woman from St. Louis, Missouri, claimed Martha was being held in a convent there. A bar patron in Texas claimed to have overheard 2 other people making incriminating statements about a fire that happened on Christmas Eve in West Virginia some years before. None of these proved significant. When George heard later that a relative of Jenny's in Florida had children that looked similar to his, the relative had to prove the children were his own before George was satisfied. In 1967, George went to the Houston area to investigate another tip. A woman there had written to the family saying that Lewis had revealed his true identity to her one night after having too much to drink. She believed that he and Maurice were both living in Texas somewhere. However, George and his son-in-law, Grover Paxton, were unable to speak with her. Police there were able to help them find the 2 men she had indicated, but they denied being the missing sons. Paxton said years later that doubts about that denial lingered in George's mind for the rest of his life. Another letter that they received that year brought the Sodders what they believed was the most credible evidence, that Elise Lewis was still alive. One day, Jenny found in the mail a letter addressed to her, postmarked in Central City, Kentucky, with no return address. Inside was a picture of a young man of around 30, with features strongly resembling Lewis's, who would have been in his 30s if he had survived. On the back was written, "Lewis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, a little boys, A90132 or 357. The family hired another private detective to go to Central City and look into the matter, but he never reported back to the Sodders, and they were unable to locate him afterwards. The picture nonetheless gave them hope. They added it to the billboard, leaving Central City out of it, and any other published information out of fear that Lewis might come to harm, and put an enlargement of it over their fireplace. George admitted to the Charleston Gazette-Mail late the next year that the lack of information had been like hitting a rock wall. We can't go any further. He nevertheless vowed to continue. Quote, "Time is running out for us," he admitted in another interview around that time, "but we only want to know. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them." End quote. George Sodder died in 1969. Jenny and her other surviving children, except John, who never talked about the night of the fire, except to say that the family should accept what happened and move on with the rest of their lives, continued to seek answers with their questions about the missing children's fate. After George's death, Jenny stayed in the family home, putting up fencing around it and adding additional rooms. For the rest of her life, she wore black in mourning and tended the garden at the side of her former house. After her death in 1989, the family finally took down the weathered, worn billboard. The surviving Sodder children, joined by their own children, continued to publicize the case and investigate leads. They, along with older Fayetteville residents, have theorized that the Sicilian Mafia was trying to extort money from George, and the children may have been taken by someone who knew about the planned arson and said they would be safe if they left the house. They were possibly taken back to Italy. If the children had survived all those years and were aware that their parents and siblings had survived, the family believes they may have avoided contact in order to keep them from harm. Sylvia Sodder Paxton, the youngest of the surviving Sodder siblings, died in 2021. She was in the house on the night of the fire, which she said was her earliest memory. Quote, "I was the last one of the kids to leave home," end quote. She recalled to the Gazette-Mail in 2013. She and her father often stayed up late, talking about what might have happened. Quote, "I experienced their grief for a long time." She believed that her siblings survived that night and assisted with efforts to find them and publicize the case. Her daughter said in 2006, quote, "She promised my grandparents she wouldn't let the story die and that she would do everything she could," end quote. In the 21st century, the family's efforts have come to include online forums like websleuths.com, in addition to media coverage. The increase in the latter has led some who have examined the case to believe that the children did, in fact, die in 1945. George Bragg, a local author who wrote about the case in his 2012 book, West Virginia's Unsolved Murders, believes that John was telling the truth in his original account when he said that he tried to physically awaken his siblings before fleeing the house. He allows that the conclusion may still not be correct. Logic tells you they probably did burn up in the fire, but you can't always go by logic, he said. Stacey Horn, who did a segment on the case for National Public Radio around its 60th anniversary in 2005, also believes the children's death in the fire is the most plausible solution. In a contemptuous post on her blog with material she had to cut from her story for time, she noted that the fire had continued to smolder all night after the house collapsed, and that 2 hours was not enough time to search the ash thoroughly. Even if it had been, the firefighters may not have known what to look for. However, she said, quote, there is enough genuine weirdness about this whole thing that if someday it is learned that the children did not die in the fire, I wouldn't be shocked. End quote. Number 1. Sarah Burton, Joplin, Missouri. Sarah Elizabeth Burton was a devoted mother of 2 young children who never took advantage of the time that she was able to spend with her friends and family. Sarah was good-hearted, though she faced her own hard times throughout her life. Sarah's childhood was seemingly average. She was a cheerleader in high school and a great student, with a good social and home life. Unfortunately, Sarah fell into addiction after graduating high school, leading her to spend a short amount of time in prison in 2010. Sarah's mother explained in interviews that after her daughter had been released from prison, she was headstrong and determined to turn her life around, which can be seen in several life changes she made since her release. Once she was released, she was able to obtain a steady job, the first step to making big changes in her life. In the months ahead of her disappearance, Sarah was living with her parents in Joplin, Missouri, and she was waiting to be placed in a local residential treatment program after stressful events in her personal life had led to her relapse. Just after midnight on July 16, 2018, Sarah is dropped off by a friend on the eastern side of Joplin, Missouri. According to this friend, Sarah had asked to be dropped off at 10th Street and Rex Avenue, so she could walk the rest of the way to her parents' home. This was believed to have been the last time Sarah was officially seen until later in the investigation. Sarah was reported missing by her mother on July 20th, after the friend who had dropped Sarah off 4 days earlier returned Sarah's purse and other personal belongings, which had been left in her car, to her parents' home. 2 months after her disappearance, in September of 2018, authorities announced an updated location where Sarah had last been seen on the night of her disappearance. Officials announced that Sarah had been seen at a residence on the western side of Joplin, shortly after she had been dropped off by her friend. Officials didn't offer any additional information at the time, though they did note that Sarah did not have access to a car. On December 18, 2018, the residence where Sarah is believed to have last been seen was searched by authorities, along with 2 vacant lots adjacent to the building. 2 days later, a property in Pittsburgh, Kansas, is searched by authorities. The property consisted of a home, 2 outbuildings, and the surrounding property. Officials didn't release any information about their search, though Sarah's mother did note in an interview that the property had been searched more than once, and that investigators told her they had developed a potential suspect. Later, on April 2, 2019, the largest search related to the investigation begins just outside of Joplin. The search, which was initially started due to a drug-related investigation, included the participation of several different agencies, including the FBI, the Ozarks Drug Enforcement Team, the Newton County Sheriff's Department, and the Missouri State Highway Patrol Diving Team. During the search, which lasted several days, items found on the property led investigators to believe that the property could be related in some way to Sarah's disappearance. Officials don't discuss any of the information gathered from the search, though they do note that they were waiting for test results from samples that were gathered from the scene to be returned from the FBI crime labs. Though there's been no concrete updates on Sarah's disappearance since the various searches conducted, on the 3rd anniversary of her disappearance, Sarah's family released an open letter to the public through law enforcement. In the letter, the Burton family expresses their wish for more information, along with a plea for answers. In a heartfelt plea for the public to come forward with information, the letter states the following, quote, 3 years is an eternity with no answers and no word from our daughter. We desperately need to know where she is. The most important thing now is bringing her home. Please help us. Her oldest son asks questions that we heartbreakingly cannot answer. It's devastating. Someone, or many, knows what or where. If you know anything, please help us bring Sarah to a final resting place. Speak up. Do it for Sarah, her 2 boys, and her family." End quote. Sarah Burton, who was 28 years old at the time of her disappearance, is described as a white female with light brown hair and blue eyes, 5 foot 7 inches tall, weighing around 120 pounds. Sarah has a scar on her forehead and was last seen wearing blue jeans, a purple and white shirt, and black flats. Today, Sarah would be 56 years old and has remained missing for the past 4 years with no sightings. The FBI is currently offering a $5,000 reward for any information leading to the arrest and conviction of the individuals responsible for her disappearance. If you have any information, please contact the Joplin Police Department at 417-623-3131, extension 440. Number 2. Elizabeth Anne Gil, or Beth, from Cape Girardeau, Missouri. Beth was only 2 years old when she vanished. She was born on August 21st, 1962, and was the youngest of 10 siblings. Her family describes her as sweet-natured, trusting, and approachable. Their family grew up in Cape Girardeau, and they felt like they could trust the people there. They lived in a home that had belonged to their family since the late 1860s. With a population of approximately 70,000 people, many people still remember Beth's case. On Sunday, June 13, 1965, Beth was home with one of her siblings. Her mother was traveling home from Chicago back to Missouri, and their father was out of town for work. By 4 p.m., it was discovered that Beth had disappeared. Her siblings and other neighborhood children looked around, and one of them contacted the police. A short time later, Beth's mother returned to a small crowd of people and the police. The search for Beth began immediately, which included canvassing the local neighborhood and dragging the Mississippi River. The next morning, police received a tip from a local mechanic. The unidentified mechanic informed authorities that there had been a couple who were waiting for a car part for their 1965 Chevy truck to arrive. It was set to arrive on Monday, June 14th, in the investigation. In January 1967, the family received a letter back from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. In the letter, he states that Beth's case was added to their missing persons file, but because there was no clear evidence of a kidnapping, the FBI didn't intervene. With the help of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, a familial DNA sample was obtained from one of Elizabeth's surviving siblings in hopes that someday a match can be made. Thankfully, in 2010, the FBI reopened and reclassified the case as a kidnapping. Authorities did interview an elderly woman, but she was hesitant to discuss what she knew, but did mention that 2 of her own family members had been involved in Beth's investigation. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Elizabeth Anne Gil, please contact the police department at 573-335-6621. Number 3. Christine Seal, Verona, Missouri. Christine Ann Nichols Seal is a 22-year-old woman living with her husband and son right outside Verona, Missouri at the time of her disappearance on June 19, 1972. She worked at a nearby salon and is known to have loved her family and would never leave her son. On the morning of June 19, 1972, Christine's husband Lynn left for work around 8 a.m., while Christine and their son David were still asleep in their beds. Around 9:30 a.m., the mailman stopped by to deliver the mail and noticed a young boy standing alone and crying inside the screen door. Lynn worked on the dairy farm where the Seal family owned a mobile home, so Lynn often stopped by the house while on a break. He went back to the house around 9:45 a.m. and found David crying alone in the kitchen. Christine was missing, along with a pair of pajamas and a light coat. Lynn called Christine's parents, Doyle and Trudy, to ask if they had seen Christine that day. They had met up the day before for a Father's Day outing, but hadn't seen her since. Police were soon contacted, and bloodhounds picked up a scent leading from the house to a spot in the yard where a car may have been, but the trail went cold there. 7 years after her disappearance, Christine was declared legally dead. Lynn and Christine divorced 2 years after her disappearance, and his second wife officially adopted David. Doyle Nickel passed away in 2019 at the age of 98, and Trudy Nickel remains a strong advocate for her daughter's case. David and Lynn still live, but David has no memory of Christine's disappearance, and Lynn has been dealing with the after effects of a concussion in recent years. At the time of her disappearance on June 19, 1972, Christine was a 22-year-old woman with brown hair and blue eyes, standing around 5'8" and weighing around 150 pounds. Today, she would be 73 years old. If you have any information about the 1972 disappearance of Christine Anna Nickel Seal, please contact the Lawrence County Sheriff's Department at 417-466-2131. Number 4. Jody Ledkins, Kansas City, Missouri. The details of Jody Ledkins' life are rather sparse. From reports, it was clear that her home life was challenging and that she would run away frequently, eventually landing in a juvenile probation program. Jody and her family moved 4 different times before her 14th birthday, eventually settling in Kansas City, Missouri. By 1981, her parents had divorced, and it wasn't long before her mother remarried, but that also ended in divorce. Then, in 1985, Jody and her mother seemed to be in a happy place, and the relationship was strengthening. On the morning of May 23, 1985, Jody skipped school with a friend, which was common for Jody. She had gotten in trouble in the past year for skipping school. A year earlier, she had pushed a security guard, which resulted in her being assigned a juvenile probation officer. The pair spends the day at her friend's Melissa Frostcloth's home, located at East 14th Street and Winchester Avenue. That evening, Jody and Melissa walked to Jody's boyfriend's house, which was located near the 700 block of Cambridge Street in Kansas City, Missouri, approximately a 14-minute walk. At some point that evening, Jody got into an argument with her friend's boyfriend. Jody wanted to go to an unknown location, but they didn't want to join her. Later, Jody and Melissa leave her boyfriend's home and head back to Melissa's home on foot. By 10 p.m., Jody calls her mother, asking for a ride home. That evening, Karen didn't have her car and was unable to pick Jody up. Jody told her mother that she'd find a ride home with a friend. Not long after the phone call with her mother, Jody leaves Melissa's home. Jody was last seen walking northbound on Winchester Avenue and 14th Street. She didn't have any extra clothing or money with her. When Melissa spoke to investigators, she was under the impression that Jody was headed back to her boyfriend's house. That next morning, Karen realizes her daughter never returned home and contacts Jody's deputy juvenile officer to report her missing. When the juvenile officer learns of Jody's disappearance, she suggests that Jody may have been upset about something and to give her the weekend to cool off. The juvenile officer did prepare 2 warrants for Jody, citing her as an endangered juvenile who should be taken into police custody if found. That advice from the juvenile officer would ultimately derail the entire case. The first 48 hours when a person goes missing are the most essential. 2 years later, while Karen was having a conversation with Jody's caseworker, it was discovered that Jody was never reported missing to the police. This conversation occurred after the first warrant was canceled by the courts in July of 1986. In 1989, Jody's juvenile officer receives a letter from an individual claiming to be Jody. The letter states that she is okay, but doesn't explain why she left. When the handwriting is compared to a previous letter Jody wrote, Karen is uncertain if the handwriting matches that of her daughter. In 1993, Karen starts getting bizarre and threatening calls, where the caller would demand money in exchange for Jody. On one occasion, the caller stated, "If we don't get the money, your daughter will be sent to you in pieces." These phone calls would last for 2 years. Luckily, Karen was able to record all of these phone calls and report them to the police. While the police were able to make transcripts and triangulate the location of the phone call to a payphone in Kansas City, the caller has never been identified. By August of that year, the case would be reclassified as a probable homicide. In 1997, 2 prison inmates claimed they had information regarding Jody's disappearance. The information brought police to the Mississippi River because the tip implied that the killer would have stashed her body in a car and then drove it into the water. However, the ensuing search was unsuccessful. Karen Stratton now lives in Arkansas but visits Kansas City a few times every year to search for her daughter. If you have any information regarding Jody Ledkins' case, please contact the Kansas City Police Department at 816-234-5140. Kairen Richard Horman was just a 7-year-old boy when he vanished without a trace from his Portland, Oregon elementary school in 2010, leaving a community in shock and desperate for answers. Despite an extensive search and numerous leads, the details surrounding Kairen's disappearance have remained shrouded in mystery, frustrating investigators and leaving Kairen's loved ones in a state of perpetual anguish. Kairen Richard Horman was born on September 9th, 2002 in Portland, Oregon, to parents Kane and Desiree. The couple divorced before Kairen was born, and he spent the first 2 years of his life living with his mother. Desiree was struggling with health problems and decided to seek treatment in Canada, so Kairen went to live with his father. Knowing that Kane, an engineer for Intel, was very busy, Desiree contacted her longtime friend Terry and asked her to move into the Horman home and become a full-time caretaker for Kairen, and Terry agreed. Kane and Terry already knew each other well. The pair had had an affair while Kane and Desiree were still married, but had since broken things off. However, when Terry moved in with them, she and Kane rekindled their romance and eventually got married in 2007. Terry already had one son of her own, James, from a previous marriage, and the following year she and Kane welcomed their first child into the world, a daughter named Kiara. Kairen Horman was a bright and energetic 7-year-old who loved the beach and dreamed of becoming a police officer one day, like his new stepfather, Tony Young. He excelled in school, was in an advanced math class, and showed a natural aptitude for learning sign language as well. Though he was clearly an intelligent child, Kairen had been having trouble with his memory in the weeks leading up to his disappearance and was said to sometimes space out during conversation. According to Terry, his doctor believed he might be having mini-seizures and scheduled an appointment for him on June the 11th, 2010. June 4th, 2010 was Science Fair Day at Skyline Elementary, Kairen's school. Kairen, whose exhibit was about red-eyed tree frogs, was excited to go to school and show off his project that day. Terry brought him to school in the morning. They left his backpack and coat in the classroom and then went to set up his exhibit. Multiple witnesses placed Kairen, Terry, and baby Kiara in the gym at just after 8 a.m. Because of the science fair, the school was open to everyone that day, and no one was required to sign in. After looking around at the other science fair exhibits, Terry and baby Kiara left the school at around 8:45 a.m. Classes were just about to start, and Terry last saw Kairen walking down the hallway towards his math class. She called out to him before leaving, and he waved goodbye. Kairen Horman would never be seen or heard from again. Kane arrived home from work at 2 p.m. that day. An hour and a half later, Kane, Terry, and Kiara went down to the bus stop to wait for Kairen. The bus arrived at its usual time, but Kairen didn't get off. According to the bus driver, he didn't get on the bus that day either. Terry called the school immediately and learned that Kairen never showed up for class and had been marked absent. According to the teacher, Terry told her that Kairen had a doctor's appointment that day. Terry would later refute this, saying that she had actually said that Kairen had an appointment for the following Friday, though it's worth mentioning that school would be out for the summer by then, so there'd be no need for her to bring it up at all. Once they all realized that Kairen was missing, the school secretary called 911 and the search ensued shortly thereafter. The search for Kairen Horman, the largest in Oregon's history, included over 1,300 searchers and spanned for 10 days. Despite all these efforts, nothing was ever found. There were no signs of Kairen anywhere. After this, Kairen's disappearance was officially considered a criminal investigation and no longer merely a missing persons case. According to Terry's own account, here is a timeline of her actions on the day Kairen went missing. 8 a.m., Kairen, Terry, and Kiara arrive at Skyline Elementary. 8:45 a.m., the last sighting of Kairen as he walked down the hallway to his math class. Terry and Kiara leave school. At 9 a.m., Terry arrives at a Fred Meyer store. She needed to pick up medication for Kiara, who had an ear infection. However, she accidentally went to the wrong Fred Meyer the first time. At 9:30 a.m., Terry arrives at the second and correct Fred Meyer store and picks up Kiara's medication. Around 10 a.m., Terry drops off her husband's dry cleaning. At 10:10 a.m., Terry stops at Michael's craft store. At 10:39 a.m., Terry makes a phone call, but to whom she made the call is not publicly known. From 10:10 a.m. to 11:39 a.m., Terry says that she was driving around because the smooth motion made her sick baby feel better. At 11:39 a.m., Terry arrives at the gym and leaves Kiara at the on-site daycare center. At 12:20 p.m., Terry and Kiara leave the gym. At 12:40 p.m., they arrive home. At 1:21 p.m., Terry uploads photos to her Facebook account, including the pictures of Kairen that she had taken that day at the science fair. At 2 p.m., Kane arrives home from work and Terry is still on the computer. At 3:30 p.m., the family heads to the bus stop to wait for Kairen. Shortly into the investigation, the police started to suspect Terry Horman of being involved in her stepson's disappearance. Out of all 4 adults, Kairen's parents and his step-parents, Terry was the only one to fail a polygraph exam, not once, but twice. A look at Terry's emails revealed that she didn't like Kairen and even blamed him for her marital troubles. She also allegedly resented the fact that Kane had made her son move out months earlier, due to the fact that Kane and James didn't get along. Additionally, just a few days after Kairen disappeared, Terry was quoted as telling Desiree, "I loved your son." Some have found this wording to be telling, as Terry was already speaking of Kairen in the past tense, while the rest of his family was still hopeful that he would be found alive and well. Was this just an unfortunate slip of the tongue, or a sign that she was already aware of his fate? Desiree, for her part, strongly believed that Terry is guilty. Kane also believes this, stating that Terry appeared to suffer from postpartum depression and a personality disorder, in addition to having a problem with alcohol. He later divorced her and filed a restraining order. Some suspected that Terry's best friend, Dee Dee Speecher, may have been involved as well, especially since she had roughly 3 hours of time that she refused to account for on the day that Kairen went missing, which just happened to overlap with when Terry was supposedly driving her baby around. It was later learned that Dee Dee was working at a local nursery that day, but since she was also collecting unemployment checks at the time, she didn't want to admit what would amount to unemployment fraud. Dee Dee has since claimed that she has been unofficially cleared of any suspicion in this case. In 2020, Rebecca Morris, author of Boy Missing: The Search for Kairen Horman, revealed that multiple witnesses reportedly spotted Kairen leaving the school with Terry and her infant daughter on the morning of June 4th. These eyewitnesses included Kairen's bus driver, a classmate, and 2 family members of the classmates. Morris wrote in her book that investigators were immediately suspicious of Kairen's stepmother because of her eerily happy and cheerful demeanor on the day of his disappearance. The book also alleged that Terry washed Kairen's jacket and backpack that day. Other claims in the book included: the day before Kairen's disappearance, Terry emailed a friend and said that she was going to leave Kane the next day and take her daughter with her. Terry wasn't able to recall or describe to police where she was for parts of the day, and she had a suspicious large gash on her leg. Despite of all this, Terry has always maintained her innocence in Kairen's disappearance. She said her own belief is that Kairen was abducted from the school, pointing out that there were known offenders living in the area at the time. 3 weeks after Kairen went missing, Kane was informed by police officers that an undercover operation was underway at his home. The reason for this was that a landscaper for the Hormans had come forward to say that Terry had attempted to hire him to murder her husband, whom she claimed was abusive toward her. Allegedly, Terry told Ronaldo Rudy Sanchez Estrada that Kane often carried large amounts of cash with him, and suggested that Rudy make Kane's murder look like a mugging, and that he was welcome to keep whatever money he found for his efforts. Perhaps realizing what was going on, an undercover agent tried to get Terry to incriminate herself, but she didn't, and no charges were ever filed. Many have questioned the veracity of Rudy's story, however, pointing out that it would have been difficult for the pair to even communicate with one another, given the fact that they couldn't speak each other's languages. Though, if the story is true, this may not have been the first time that Terry had attempted such a thing. Sean Ray, an ex-boyfriend of Terry's, came forward to say that he believed that she had hired a hitman to kill him back in 1990. On the day in question, the two were having lunch in the park when they were approached by a man holding a gun. Terry supposedly got up and shouted to Sean, "He's here for you." But the man, perhaps losing his nerve, didn't fire and instead just ran away. Sean broke up with Terry following the incident and moved away soon after. In the years following Kairen's disappearance, Terry has been in trouble with the law, both for driving a stolen car and for stealing a gun from her roommate. She was also accused of domestic violence in 2016 by her then partner, Joseph Cristobal. In 2012, a county circuit court judge called Terry a prime suspect, but no concrete evidence linking her or anyone else to Kairen's disappearance has ever been found. The Multnomah County Sheriff's Office stated that it's received over 4,000 tips since Kairen's disappearance in 2010. Spokesman Chris Lindell said that authorities continue to get 1 to 20 leads every month and have 2 detectives and an FBI agent assigned to the case full-time. During their investigation, agents conducted DNA analysis on Kairen's toothbrush and uploaded his dental characteristics and x-rays to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons database, hoping for a match with one of the thousands of unidentified victims around the country. Police have also continued to release age-progressed photos of Kairen. Despite these efforts, there has been no further developments announced in the case. Nevertheless, his family has not given up hope that he might still be out there somewhere. On what would have been Kairen's 20th birthday on September 9th, 2022, his family hosted a car wash. All proceeds went toward the continued efforts to locate Kairen. His mother, Desiree, also organized a rally outside the county district attorney's office and called for a new task force to strategize how to pursue a no-body homicide prosecution. During a news conference, Desiree spoke of the pain that she still experiences. Quote, "Making the drive in for 12 years and pulling up to the school and knowing this was the last place Kairen was. I can't even imagine the anguish and the heartache." End quote. In a statement to the media, County DA Mike Schmidt wrote, quote, "My heart goes out to Kairen's family and the dedicated and compassionate community they have built around his disappearance. To date, this case is open, and we remain committed to investigating new facts and evidence should either surface." End quote. If you have any information related to the disappearance of Kairen Richard Horman, please call the police department at 503-988-4300. Reed Taylor Jepson was born on May 28, 1949, to Elizabeth and Edward Jepson. Reed was one of 11 children in a large Mormon family in Salt Lake City, Utah. The Eagle Scout was a good student, well liked by his peers, and had a part-time job as a paperboy. Reed also had 2 German short-haired pointers, a full-grown dog and a puppy, whom he enjoyed training to hunt birds. Additionally, he played for his school's football team and had recently scored his first touchdown. At the time he went missing, 15-year-old Reed Jepson was a sophomore at East High School in Salt Lake City. On the morning of Sunday, October 11, 1964, the Jepson family attended church as per usual. When they returned home early that afternoon, Reed opened a can of dog food and told his sister Suzanne that he was heading out to feed his dogs. She said, "Hurry back because we're going to have dinner in 30 minutes. And Reed replied, "Oh, I'll be back." Wearing a reversible black parka with blue lining and Levi's jeans, Reed left the Jepson home and walked the 200 yards to the family's dog kennel. The Jepson family would never see or hear from him again. One of Reed's friends reportedly spotted him walking the dogs near the College of St. Mary of the Watch, approximately 50 minutes away from his home around 1 p.m. After this, all his moves are a mystery. Later that night, when Reed had been gone for almost 12 hours, his family filed a missing persons report with the Salt Lake City Police Department. Then the search for Reed Jepson began. Accompanied by the Jepson family, law enforcement conducted an extensive search in and around Salt Lake City, including the foothills. But neither Reed nor his dogs, nor any clue as to what had happened to them, were ever found. Sources were inconsistent about whether Reed was carrying any money with him that day. But according to the Desert News, on October 16, 1964, he had $60, money he had saved from his paperboy job when he left his home, roughly equivalent to $582 today. If true, it's unclear what would have compelled him to carry such a large sum of money if he only intended to take a short walk with his pets. There were a number of unconfirmed sightings of the dogs in the days following their disappearance, but law enforcement believed that these accounts were inaccurate and referred to different dogs. Although it may not be relevant to this case, one of the dogs had reportedly gone missing at an earlier date and returned after 2 weeks. There were witnesses who claimed to see Reed as well, but none of these sightings were confirmed. The authorities in 3 states were notified of Reed Jepson's disappearance. At one point, law enforcement believed Reed may have trekked to Missouri to visit a girl he had met while working on a ranch there one summer. However, this lead too went nowhere. According to John Jepson, Reed's older brother, a detective arrived at the family's home one day and requested to speak with the 16-year-old. John complied and the two went for a drive. This is a partial account of John's conversation with the detective. "Okay, John, where is he?" And John says, "I don't know." Detective: "You do know, and you've caused incredible heartache to your parents. You're hiding him. You're doing something in connection with his disappearance. Now it's time to stop playing games and tell us where he is." End quote. Apparently, one of Reed's friends who lived in their neighborhood had implicated John in Reed's disappearance. Unfortunately, the reasons for this are unknown. For his part, John maintained that he had no idea where his brother was, and that he had no knowledge of what had happened to him. It would appear that the detective was satisfied with John's answers, since he was never questioned again. The Jepson family strongly believed Reed was abducted and were certain he would have never left them voluntarily. However, no evidence of foul play was ever discovered. There was allegedly a known offender living in the area at the time of Reed's disappearance. He was eventually questioned by police. The behavior of the man, whose name was never released to the public during the interrogation, was reportedly troubling. He said, "I'll tell you one thing. I would appreciate your finding out who killed him." The officer responds, "How do you know Reed was killed instead of running away? Most of the gossip said Reed was a runaway." The man replied, "Well, I know that this length of time, they're never going to find out." End quote. In a police report, it was noted that the man chuckled after speaking. However, investigators said he wasn't known to be violent and cleared him of all suspicion. No trace of Reed or his dogs was ever found, and in the absence of any evidence, the case was officially closed in 1966. The Jepsons were said to be a very tight-knit family that was deeply affected by Reed's disappearance. Sadly, tragedy struck the Jepson family once again when Edward Jepson, Reed's father, ended his own life on December 18, 1965, just over a year after his son had vanished. Reed's mother, Elizabeth, as well as several of his siblings, passed away in the years that followed, tragically never getting the closure of a definitive answer about what had happened to Reed. Reed's sister, Suzanne Tate, spent 57 years of her life thinking about what may have happened to her brother. She described the effect that Reed's loss had on their family. Quote, "When you have someone missing, the victim, the missing person, isn't the only victim. The whole family starts to suffer. First, there's the worrying, then that turns into frustration, and after years and years, despair sets in." End quote. In 2021, Tate said she was still haunted by the thoughts of Reed. "You just keep thinking, what happened to my little brother?" Tate said. "Where did he go? What did he go through?" Police reopened Reed Jepson's case in 2010 to remind the public his case was still unsolved. Quote, "Somebody out there in the community knows something about this case," end quote, Detective Cody Laffey told reporters. Investigators took DNA samples from living members of the family and checked them against a database of unidentified deceased persons. The authorities also released an age-progressed image that approximates what Jepson might look like today. In 2012, the police received a tip about a man who found animal bones on his property. Quote, "He said it looked like two dogs, a large one and a small one. We believe they were Reed's two dogs," end quote. Police searched a gully in Salt Lake City with shovels and a backhoe, looking for Reed's remains, but nothing was ever found. Officer Josh Ashdown had this to say about the tip. Quote, "Because of the nature of the case, I can't get into that specifically, but enough of a tip that it was worth coming out here and digging with some cadaver dogs," end quote. Reed Jepson's unexplained disappearance is the oldest unsolved missing persons case on file at the Salt Lake City Police Department. According to Suzanne Tate, the Jepsons family considered many possibilities to explain his disappearance. An animal attack was proposed, though they wondered how such an incident would have left no trace of Reed or his two dogs. Some members also reportedly believed the boy experienced some kind of freak accident, such as falling into a cave in the foothills or mountain. Tate presented her own theory, which was considerably more sinister. Quote, "I had told my mother I believe a offender got a hold of him," end quote, she said. Though a local offender was cleared of any involvement back in 1964, Tate thinks her brother's killer has gotten away. There may never be an answer to this tragic enigma, though Gordon Parks, a cold case investigator for the department, said he hasn't given up and that he would like to interview Reed's school classmates. Authorities in Salt Lake City encourage anyone with information on the case to submit a tip. Meanwhile, there is still a headstone for Reed at the SLC cemetery that is engraved with his name, birth date, and the day he went missing, October 11th, 1964. "We just feel like our family has been robbed of a wonderful addition to the family," Tate said. His chance for life was stolen from him. If you have any information on the disappearance of Reed Jepson, please contact the Salt Lake City Police Department at 801-799-3100. Again, that's 801-799-3100. Dorothy, or Dora Cooper, was born in the fall of 1909 to parents John and Della. One of 6 children, Dora grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Little information about Dora's early life is publicly available, but we know she met her future husband, Jules Fornstein, when the two were just children. However, they lost touch for several years after reaching adulthood. On July 3, 1940, Jules's first wife, Molly, died in childbirth at the age of 33. The couple had 2 daughters, Myrna and Marcy. Sometime later, Jules and Dora reconnected and eventually married in 1942. Afterwards, Dora legally adopted Myrna and Marcy. 2 years later, she gave birth to a boy named Edward. Those who knew Jules and Dora stated that they appeared to have a very happy marriage. Jules had a successful career as a magistrate, and the growing family lived in a 3-story brick home in Philadelphia. Everything seemed to be going well for the Fornsteins, but unfortunately, that was about to change. On January 25, 1945, Dora left the children at a neighbor's house and went shopping. She chatted with store employees as she went about her day. Nothing seemed amiss. However, when neighbor Maria Townley spotted Dora walking home that evening, Maria noticed that a man seemed to be following her. Since it was a safe neighborhood, Maria didn't think much of it at the time and simply assumed that the man was with Dora. But when Dora opened the front door, the stranger seized on the opportunity and jumped out at her, pushing her inside the house. He beat her with his fist as well as a blunt instrument. It's still unclear if the exact object was ever determined, but he knocked her unconscious. In the struggle, the phone had come off the hook and the operator on the other end heard the brutal attack as it was happening in real time. Alarmed, the operator notified the police right away, who arrived shortly and found Dora on the floor, covered in blood. Her assailant was long gone by then. She was rushed to the hospital, where it was learned that Dora had suffered a concussion, a broken nose, a broken jaw, and a dislocated shoulder. She was unable to identify her attacker or give many details about what had happened. Law enforcement felt uncertain that this was an attempted murder. What they couldn't figure out, though, was who would want to hurt Dora. She was well liked and had no enemies as far as anyone knew. Jules himself was ruled out as a suspect early on due to a solid, verifiable alibi. The authorities came to the conclusion that the assailant was likely someone that Jules had come into contact with while doing his work as a magistrate. Perhaps someone who wanted revenge against him. But who? Jules was at a loss and could provide no leads or potential suspects. In fact, he didn't believe that there was anyone who bore such ill will against him. Yet someone clearly wanted the kind and unassuming Dora dead. But why? While she mostly recovered physically, she would go on to have periodic problems with her shoulder. There was a marked change in her personality. The previously happy and outgoing Dora became paranoid and reclusive, obsessively checking to make sure the doors and windows were locked multiple times a day. She hated the dark or to be left alone. As a result, Jules did his best to never stay out late or leave his family alone for too long. Law enforcement made little progress in Dora's case, but eventually they had a person of interest, a man named Morris Anmuth. In September 1944, Anmuth was part of a group of individuals who had assembled to protest then-Republican U.S. President candidate Thomas E. Dewey while he made a speech at the Pennsylvania Railroad station. Police officers Samuel Ralston and James McCarthy noticed Anmuth had perceived him as a danger. They pulled him out of the crowd and arrested him, charging him with inciting to riot, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest. Anmuth was fined $10, roughly $173 today. Soon after the incident, Anmuth filed assault and battery charges against the two policemen, alleging that they had severely beaten him after his arrest. The two men were held on a $1,000 bail each, over $17,000 today, by Magistrate James McBride. However, the charges were later dropped by none other than Magistrate Jules Fornstein. Was this motive enough for the attempted murder of Dora? That remains unknown. It's also unclear what action the police took against Anmuth relating to Dora's case, if any, or whether he was ever even questioned. Evidently, there was little to no evidence otherwise, aside from the circumstantial, to implicate him in Dora's assault, and so he was never charged. On the evening of October the 18th, 1949, Jules had a political banquet to attend. He spoke to Dora on the phone and let her know that he was going to be later than usual. Despite this, she seemed to be in good spirits, and ended the call with, quote, "Be sure to miss me," end quote. Around 9 p.m., she called a friend and arranged to go shopping together the following day. This would be the last time anyone ever heard from Dora Fornstein. Later that night, 9-year-old Marcy was awakened by strange sounds. She opened her door and was alarmed to find a man she had never seen before walking up the stairs. Across the hallway, she noticed that her parents' bedroom door was open and saw her mother lying on the floor face down in her pajamas, apparently unconscious. The unidentified man, described by Marcy as wearing a brown hat and jacket and being approximately the same age as her father, proceeded to pick Dora up and put her over his shoulder. The terrified Marcy asked the intruder what he was doing, to which he responded, "Go back to sleep, little one. Your mom is fine," and patted her on the head before walking downstairs with her mother still slumped over his shoulder. There are several slightly different versions of what the abductor said to Marcy, but I've included the most often reported version here. He carried Dora outside and locked the door behind him, vanishing into the night. Marcy ran into her brother Edward's bedroom and waited for their father to come home. The oldest daughter, 19-year-old Myrna, was spending the night at a friend's house. Jules arrived home around 11:30 p.m. and found Marcy and Edward clinging to each other in one of the bedrooms, crying, "Mommy's gone." Marcy informed her father about what had happened, stating that the intruder had left with Dora just 15 minutes earlier. Strangely, though it was extremely uncharacteristic of Dora to leave her children alone, Jules didn't believe Marcy's story initially. He assumed that Dora had simply left to visit a friend or a neighbor. Yet what reason would he have to think that Marcy would make up such a disturbing story? Regardless, Jules began to make phone calls, trying to find out exactly where his wife was. Out of all the friends and family members he contacted, he wasn't able to find a single person who had seen or heard from her since 9 p.m. After she had been missing for hours, Jules and Arthur, Dora's brother, went out to look for her in the middle of the night. They found nothing. There was no sign of Dora anywhere. Jules and Arthur reported Dora Fornstein missing at 3:40 a.m. Captain James A. Kelly of the Philadelphia Homicide Division promptly began an investigation into her disappearance. He went door to door talking to people in the neighborhood, but no one had witnessed anything or could provide any information about either Dora's whereabouts or who might have taken her. Jules' alibi for the evening was quickly verified. He also made the vague statement to investigators that his wife wasn't in good health. Like Jules, the police were skeptical of the child's account and sent her to a psychiatrist to be interviewed. However, after speaking to Marcy at length, the psychiatrist was convinced that she was, in fact, telling the truth. As with the 1945 attack, the police once again believed that Dora's assailant was probably someone with a grudge against Jules. But there was no evidence for this, or anything else for that matter. There were no signs of forced entry, and the intruder hadn't left behind any fingerprints. Nothing, aside from Dora, appeared to be missing from the home. So who was this person, and how did he get inside? All her belongings, including her purse and keys, were also left behind. Presumably, he had already been upstairs before Marcy woke up, given Dora's state. Yet why had he gone back downstairs again, before coming up? Had he been looking for something? Many aspects of Dora Fornstein's case continue to defy explanation. A search of hospitals, morgues, and hotels conducted across the country turned up nothing. Law enforcement would investigate nearly 100 tips in just the week after Dora went missing, but no suspects or promising leads ever came from all their efforts. Just when it looked like Dora Fornstein's case couldn't be any more perplexing or bizarre, a sighting would prove that assumption wrong. A patrolman named Edward Shapiro came forward to report that he had seen a woman who resembled Dora only days after she went missing, emerging from a telephone booth inside a candy store. She seemed suspicious of him from the outset, according to his account, and tried to keep her distance from the policeman. Next, he followed her into a tavern and found her drinking a beer. However, as soon as she noticed him, she hurriedly exited the bar. Her reaction isn't necessarily compelling in itself, since being watched and followed by a stranger would make most people uneasy. Shapiro claimed to have seen the same woman again the following night. This time she was speaking to a man on the street corner and joking about only having one arm. Since Dora had recurrent issues with her shoulder since the 1945 attack, this comment is possibly significant. The woman was never seen again after this and has never been positively identified as Dora Fornstein. As for his part, Chief Kelly was puzzled by Shapiro's story. She is either a victim of foul play or amnesia, he would go on to say. Ultimately, the search would expand to include 11 states. Still, no answers were forthcoming. Dora Fornstein was never found. Jules Fornstein had a heart attack shortly after his wife vanished, but he recovered. He also put up a $1,000 reward for information leading to his wife's whereabouts. The reward has never been claimed. Jules, who never remarried, died December 30th, 1955, after suffering another heart attack. He left behind an estate valued at $4,906 to his 3 children. Dora herself left behind $9,946 in securities in her safe deposit box. What those securities consisted of or where they came from is still unclear. Months after Jules' passing, Dora was declared legally dead on October the 18th, 1956, the 7th anniversary of her disappearance. Myrna, 26, took custody of her 2 younger siblings. In the early 2000s, a blogger who made a detailed post about Dora's case allegedly received a message from the Fornstein family attorney politely asking them to remove the post. Several other content creators reportedly received a similar message, although if I ever do, I'll be sure and let you guys know. Why the remaining Fornsteins would want Dora's disappearance to stop receiving attention remains unknown. To this day, several decades later, the circumstances surrounding 40-year-old Dora Fornstein's abduction, the identity of her abductor, as well as the motive behind her earlier attack, all remain a mystery, and thus her case remains unexplained. As this compilation comes to an end, we reflect on the enduring mysteries of these missing persons cases, Their stories, etched in our hearts, serve as a reminder to never forget. Let's continue to share their stories, raise awareness, and support organizations dedicated to finding answers. Together, we can make a difference. So until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I'll be seeing you on Down the Road a Ways. Biker, out.